kick it off.
Okay.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much for being with us today and for being with us throughout this entire series. We have had a blast just being able to talk with you about a variety of different topics related to school safety. And so today we're going to be talking about evolving with your safety plan and really staying current with the times and staying current in a sort of chronological and annual fashion, but also staying current as an emergency unfolds. And so we'll talk a little bit about the sort of moments at the beginning of an emergency and how those relate and translate into the emergency unfolding. And then we'll also talk about making sure that we're prepared for any emergency that may occur. One of the things that we've been talking about a lot this year is data security and business continuity plans for schools. And the reason for that is that 10 years ago, we didn't have to worry about data security the way that we do today. We've looked around and seen hacks and challenges that have hit schools and businesses alike. And so for one reason or another, those have now become part of our emergency planning on a regular basis. But if you are still looking at 20 years ago and trying to revise that same plan, you may be in trouble. In fact, you probably don't have any sort of preparedness in place for your data or for your technology systems or the overall business that you do on a day-to-day basis, how you receive tuition payments and how you pay vendors and employees and things like that. And so if you haven't begun to incorporate those things, rest assured we'll talk all about them. We'll sort of kick off the conversation today, but then throughout the rest of the series, and incidentally this series will last through the end of this school year, we'll be talking about things like continuity itself and technology and disaster recovery and how to incorporate facilities into your continuity plan and into your emergency plan. And so today, again, we'll kick off the Evolving with Your Safety Plan or Evolving Your Safety Plan conversation. Just real quick, my name's Chris, and I'm the founder and CEO of Joffe Emergency Services, and we do school safety on a national level, and we work with schools particularly in Southern California, Northern California, and the Northeast, but we don't turn schools away, or at least we try really hard not to, in other regions. And again, some of the things that we deal with are your basics, your fires, your earthquakes, your lockdowns, your bad weather. Other things we deal with are a little bit more specific, so individual student concerns and creating health plans and action plans for students with diabetes or epilepsy. We help consult schools when it comes to reporting child abuse and some of those really tough issues that oftentimes schools are prepared for and equipped for because they need to deal with them, but they don't necessarily have all of the components in place, or they're not exactly sure how to facilitate the best conversation with the family or with any other parties that may need to get involved. And so again, today we're talking about evolving with your safety plan, so we're still talking at that bigger macro level. And of course, as you have questions, we invite you to share those with us. On the right-hand side of your screen, you should see a panel that'll say go to webinar. And about halfway down that, you should see a box that'll allow you to ask questions and contribute. And in fact, it looks like we already see a hand raised. So Pam, I'll ask if you can go ahead and share your question with us in the question box. We'll go ahead and make sure that we answer that at some point during the conversation today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Katelyn, who will lead us through our conversation. And welcome, Katelyn.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Again, if you guys have been following, you guys probably have heard me before, but if you have not, my name is Katelyn. I'm a safety consultant up here in the Northern California, specifically the San Francisco Bay Area. I work primarily with schools. I do some BLS instructing, so we do lots of training, and I'm also an EMT as well, so I do have some experience working in the field, and I love bringing that and sharing that with you guys. So today, kind of where we're going, I just want to talk a little bit about what a safety plan is and what it should consist of before we actually talk about evolving your safety plan, why it's important to have that safety plan, and then we'll actually talk about what it means to evolve your safety plan. You'll kind of hear me going back and forth with Chris today, so it's going to be the both of us on here just for your guys' information if you hear us back and forth. Let's start off the day. We're going to talk about what a safety plan is, just in case you are not familiar with the term. Most people should be, but some people are not. So just a quick definition, a safety plan is classified as a plan that's developed with the intention of providing an organized and universally understood course of action in the event of an unusual circumstance or an emergency. Put differently, It is something written down that tells you what to do when you're in an emergency. Safety plans are really, really important. It's, I believe, required by state that schools have a safety plan, so everybody should be aware of what one is, and or if their organization has one, they should know where it's at and they should know what's in it. Safety plans are evolved and kind of adapted for each school. Safety plans here in California are not going to be the same as safety plans that are in the Northeast, and I work with one of my colleagues, Yadija. You guys have heard him on some of these webinars as well. When we're developing our safety plans for our schools and helping develop those, it's almost we have a different set of circumstances or emergencies that we have to think about. On the East Coast, they have hurricanes and tornadoes, which are not as prevalent over here on the East Coast, on the West Coast, but we have earthquakes, which are a lot more prevalent over here. So safety plans, again, just a document, a handbook, a piece of equipment that is made available to all teachers, staff, faculty, part-time employees, substitute teachers, and it classifies what you're supposed to do in an emergency situation. Just a quick poll question for you guys. You'll see it pop up here in just a second. How many of you guys feel confident in the safety plan that your organization has in place at this moment in time? Give it just a second. You'll see it pop up on your screen. It's a yes or no question, basically saying if you feel confident or not.
And I'll jump in as you are selecting your option and evaluating whether you feel confident in your plan that's in place. Just to say that, as Katelyn mentioned earlier, there is a requirement in most states, believe it or not, not all, but in most states, that you have a safety plan in place. And what challenges me about that requirement is that it literally says you must have a safety plan in place. It does not detail the specifics that must be contained within that plan. It does not articulate exactly what you are supposed to do. And frankly, having a safety plan in place may not actually be protecting you if it's not comprehensive enough. And at the same time, I cannot tell you how many safety plans that I've looked at that talk about fallen aircraft and the zombie apocalypse and any number of other things. And although those may be appropriate on Halloween, they're not necessarily appropriate for any school in any area. And so, having a safety plan is important. And the confidence, and in fact, this poll question is directly asking about the confidence in the overall plan, because having a safety plan in and of itself is not enough. Having a safety plan, though, that's comprehensive, that's articulated throughout your community, that frankly your parents, your students, of course your staff and your faculty and your leadership team, but that everybody truly can be comfortable with. And that may mean you even have 2 or 3 different versions of that plan. One of the things that we do for a lot of our schools, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the conversation today, but we will establish a safety plan for the general community, and that's typically a pretty restricted document. We share it with staff and faculty, and we share it certainly with the leadership team, and the board may even ask for it every once in a while. But then we'll create a secondary version of that same plan that's geared to parents and students. And so it doesn't necessarily talk about the data and the continuity element and some of those sort of more complex areas, but it does talk specifically about what parents' involvement and role in the emergency plan is. So when it comes time to reunify your students and to put them back together with their parents, it gives them the ability to follow their steps and their guide about what they're supposed to do. Likewise, it will prepare your students for what they're going to be doing on the blacktop, in the gym, wherever they are, where they're lined up and evacuated post-emergency. And it can talk about the activities that may be available for them to conduct and things of that nature. So a safety plan certainly is important, but the next step, and really the thing that I challenge each of you to think about as we talk today, is the comprehensive nature of that safety plan and ensuring that it's not just a plan that's documented and frankly maybe even big enough to hold a door open, but that it's a plan that you can tear into, you can grab, you can use, and you can actually consult with during a real emergency. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Katelyn.
Thank you. So it looks like here we're sitting at about a 50-50. Some of you guys do feel confident in the safety plans that you have, and some of you guys don't. In just a second, we're going to talk about what a safety plan actually should consist of, which we've kind of been alluding to throughout this entire morning. And then we'll kind of talk about how those play a role and move on from there. So just a second, let me get over to the next slide. There we go. So what should a safety plan consist of? Now, let me go back for a second. Let me just talk a little bit about this real quick. So a lot of the time when I work with my schools, we notice that some organizations have 3 or 4 different types of manuals that are all out of date. None of them came out at the same time, and they all say different things. What I work with my schools and I try and do is I try and condense all of that, take all of the good information from all of them, and create one comprehensive manual. It's a safety handbook, and then we create something that's called a quick guide as well, which is what Chris was just talking about. So we'll talk about those and what they kind of mean. So for your safety handbook, that is your comprehensive manual. You put your protocols for earthquake, fire, lockdown, shelter in place, secure campus, hurricanes, tornadoes, whatever emergencies are pertinent for your organization, and you have to think geographically with this as well. Like I mentioned earlier, in the Northeast, they need to worry about hurricanes and tornadoes more so than we do out here on the West Coast. In your comprehensive manual, it's usually, we try and make them less than 30 pages or so. I've seen some safety handbooks that are just overkill. They are tons and tons and tons of information, and it makes it so overwhelming for people that they don't even take the time to sit down and read through it, so they're not prepared for an emergency because they haven't actually read their safety handbook. In the safety handbook, this is kind of our go-to guide. Everything pertaining to safety from there on out will come from this handbook. So this quick guide that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, it comes from your safety handbook. With the safety handbook, you have to make sure that it has compliance with the state and the municipal laws. We have one here in San Mateo County. It's called the Big Five, and it basically states 5 training types. There's drop, cover, and hold, earthquake, lockdown. There's 5 of them, and those have to be incorporated into the safety handbooks for all these schools that are here in San Mateo County. So there's things like that. Just make sure that you're aware of what's in your area or what have you. In your comprehensive manual as well, I've noticed the reason that we like to do an actual handbook is because, like I mentioned earlier, people tend to have a whole bunch of resources, but they're kind of just scattered everywhere. There's the emergency phone number list, there is the command center, and if there is an emergency, there is a breakdown of who's in charge, and all these documents are kind of just laying all over the place. So we put those together with the protocols, and it keeps all of your safety information all together. Safety handbook should answer the question, how do we plan to sustain our staff, faculty, and students if we cannot resume normal school activities? So it should be able to get you through if there was, it's unfortunate to say this, but if there was a huge fire or something like that, and your building burns down and you actually cannot resume normal activities. What do we do in that, hours and potentially even days after this happens that we could potentially still have staff and faculty and students here? It's also intended to outline your protocol. It details your plan of what you're supposed to do immediately and then extended, like I was just mentioning. It should have your emergency contacts, your chain of command. These are great for training. When training people, you can pull bits and pieces from the safety handbook. The cool thing about having an actual handbook as well is when you're doing this training, you can make sure that all of them have it in their hands so they can flip through and actually read it with you while you're doing it. So they know where it's at, they know where to reference it, and things like that. It's also great for initial exposure for new teachers. When you get a new teacher that comes on site, it's a little bit overwhelming, especially if they come from a different school. They have different protocols at that school because there's different things that they're dealing with. They could have come from a school that's right in the middle of a city and they're coming to a more rural area now, and there's different things that you have to be worried about. So these are great for initial exposure for those new teachers because they can go through, read it, kind of see what's different about this school, and see how everything works with this particular school. and they're great for answering all safety-related questions. A lot of people will come to you throughout the year. What do we do with an EpiPen? What do we do when we have this first aid emergency? What do we do if a gas line bursts? Things like that. All of that stuff can be answered within your safety handbook. Going back to this slide, we're going to look at the quick guide as well. So going off of that safety handbook, that's more of a, like I said, a comprehensive manual. It's going to be a answer all kind of thing. The quick guide is what Chris was mentioning earlier. You can do these for multiple different purposes. So we call them at a glance. I'll show you an example of one in just a second so you can kind of understand what we're talking about. Usually it's a one-pager, a front and back. It's a reference sheet, and actually just pulls excerpts from the existing protocols, or it pulls excerpts from that safety handbook that you already have in place. And it's really intended, it depends on who it's intended for, in which you would make it. So some of these we do for classrooms, right? We'll place one in the classroom, and I'll show you the example that we have in just a second. You'll place it in the classroom, and it basically says, what are you immediately supposed to do in an emergency? You can also do those quick guides and those at-a-glances for the parents when they come and they do the reunification. What is required of me? You will be required to have a photo ID on you. You will be required to, release your student doing this, what have you. So you can do those for, again, the classrooms, the parents, however you need to adapt it. These are really good guides. Quick guides are supposed to answer the question, what is the immediate protocol we follow when there's an emergency on campus? It's usually simplified into lockdown, fire, earthquake protocols. We're talking about the one that's on campus. And it's intended just to get you through the first minutes of an emergency. A quick guide is not intended to tell you it's not intended to answer all those questions. How do we set up camp if we need to stay here for a long period of time? How do we deal with EpiPens? How do we administer this kind of medication? What is our protocol for this, and what is our protocol for that? It's really just to get you through those first minutes of an emergency when it actually happens. I love the idea of the quick guide because they're great for substitute teachers, they're great for interim teachers, and they're awesome for that emergency brain, i.e. an emergency happens and all the training that you learned just went out the window and you have no idea what you're doing anymore. This quick guide tells you exactly what to do. Substitute teachers, obviously not going to be on campus all the time. They should still have access to the safety handbook, but that doesn't necessarily mean that since they're a substitute teacher, they only work for your school. So they may have tons and tons of different schools that they're working for, and they need to know the protocols or have them easily accessible at all times. Interim teachers as well, usually they'll come in, say it's like maternity leave or things like that. They'll be there for a couple of months at a time, or a medical leave. They'll be there for a couple months, and they obviously need to know the protocols as well, and chances are they will go through the safety handbook because they're there for longer than just one day, but they won't have as extensive training as all of your teachers will. And the emergency brain, that's pretty self-explanatory. A lot of people don't do exactly what they think they're going to do, or don't react the way that they think they're going to in an emergency, so it's great to just take a look at this and have everything laid out for you. Let's see. Whoops, going backwards. So this right here, if you see on the right-hand side of your page, this is kind of just one of the ones that we use. I know it's a little bit blurry, but you kind of get the gist of it. It's one sheet. It has the most pertinent emergencies for this particular organization, and it seems really silly, but we also talk about how to dial 911. A lot of campuses and organizations, in order to get a line out, basically meaning that they can call out and not on campus, you have to dial 9 or an 8 or something like that. And an emergency is not when you want to be figuring out how to dial out. So we like to lay them out right here up at the top in this area. It tells you how to dial 911, it tells you what information, it tells you who needs to be notified, and it tells you it tells you what steps of action you're supposed to take while dialing 911. These here in the fire, earthquake, and lockdown, it just has kind of your immediate fire, recognize bell tones, evacuate students, if safe to do so, bring this, this, and this, turn off the lights, close the door, get out as quickly as possible. And these are really awesome. I have some schools that will make their at-a-glance or their quick guide that is specific to their school. They'll laminate it and then they'll just place it right on the wall. Some schools as well will do like I have a high school that does a front and back at-a-glance. The front side is during school hours and the back side is after school hours. I noticed this was one of our big challenges when I started working with them. They have lots of students that are on campus after school hours, and it's not like a after school program care kind of thing that most elementary schools have. It's kind of like they'll just be hanging out, or they're doing sports, or they're doing what have you, studying in the library. So there needed to be a plan of action for that as well. Okay. Moving forward, there is another poll question that's just about to pop up on your screen. How many of you all actually have a comprehensive safety plan that covers all of these bases? We'll give it just a couple more seconds. Okay, so it looks like we're sitting at about a 50-50 as well. So again, safety plans are really, really, really important. Now speaking about it after the fact, I hope that you guys kind of understand that having everything all in one place really makes more sense, and it really helps in the event of an emergency. Just having everything kind of there for you to grab, and you don't have to run around grabbing a whole bunch of different sheets, and something that actually answers all of those really hard questions. Again, how do I use an EpiPen? What is our protocol for delivering medication? What is our protocol for when parents come to pick up their students in an emergency? What information do we need from them? So the comprehensive manual should cover all of those bases. It's really helpful for you guys. If you guys need help with that, you guys can always reach out to us. We are trying to sign on more schools as well, so please feel free to reach out. We love doing this stuff. Let's talk about, just real quick, real briefly, why is it important to actually have a safety plan? Well, for one, most simply, most state laws require you to have one. So you have to have one, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good one. It aids and it eases in training and orientation, like I mentioned earlier, for the teachers and the substitute teachers and things like that. You can always pull excerpts from it. It's a direct guide. If anybody has any questions, you can always direct them there. It also gives a sense of workplace security. It helps with your teacher retention and your student performance if you actually have a good safety plan. Teachers will want to stay at the school. Teachers will want to work for you if they feel like you care about their safety and their well-being by having a good safety plan. Students as well, on the other side of that, the student performance actually increases if they feel like they're in a safe environment. And their parents as well, if their parents feel like they're in a safe environment, they give their students a good vibe about the school, and that also helps their performance as well. And again, this is something that we just always stress, and you've probably heard this and over some of our last webinars, but preparedness helps immensely in the event of an actual emergency. A lot of people think they're going to react one way in an emergency, and it actually doesn't happen that way at all. If they have that preparedness, if they have that training, if they have these guides that they can go to, it helps immensely because it gives them an actual sort of checklist for them to go through and actually check off while they're trying to deal with this emergency. All right. This is, I have one more poll question for you guys. This is the last one that I'm going to throw at you today. When was the last time that your organization actually updated your safety plan? You'll see it in just a second, and just after this, we're going to actually talk about how to evolve your safety plan, what that means. Let's see. Okay, I'll give it maybe 10 more seconds or so. Okay, so it looks, this is really good. I actually like to see this. It looks like a good majority of you guys, about 65% of you guys, updated it a year ago, somewhere around there, and everybody else did about 2 to 4 years ago. It seemed kind of silly that I put 5 to 7 and even 8 years ago on there. The only reason that I put those on there is because I do work with some schools where they haven't updated their plan in that long. I was looking at the safety plan for one of my schools, and they still had protocols in there from the Loma Prieta earthquake, which was, I believe, in '89. So that's a very, very long time ago. And they obviously had added to it and things like that, but a good majority of these plans hadn't been updated in that long. They didn't even have a lockdown procedure in there. So it's really important to update your safety plan and evolve it to things that are going on nowadays. So what does it mean to evolve your safety plan? We want you to adopt a think in the moment kind of mindset. We'll talk about each of these in just a second. It's good to learn from the past, and then from there you need to adopt new policies based on what we've learned. So that think in the moment kind of mindset, sometimes having a safety plan just isn't always enough. Emergencies are unpredictable. You need to have that mindset of anything can happen, and you have to train your staff and faculty. Emergencies are not only unpredictable in the sense that we don't know when they're going to happen, but we don't know what's going to happen when they actually do. So we can plan and we can train and we can do all these things, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the emergency that your staff and faculty are being faced with is actually going to be outlined in that safety plan or that safety handbook. You have to train to be in that mindset of anything can happen. Think on your feet. You need to be a problem solver. What makes sense? What makes the most sense? A lot of people tend to think of emergencies in the tone of, I have to have a plan, I have to have a protocol. Well, if you're in this situation where you have an unpredictable emergency, this mindset of anything can happen can really help you out, because basically it helps you use your common sense. A lot of people discredit common sense when it comes to emergencies, and it's almost like you have to train people to think with common sense. So just think in the moment. It's easier definitely said than done, but if you bring up the topic, you talk about it, and you kind of get that idea across to your staff and faculty, usually that will kind of ease the transition into having to use that mindset when faced with one of these situations. We need to also learn from the past. This is one of the biggest things when talking about evolving your safety plan. We absolutely have to learn from the past. Chris and I were just talking the other day about what we were going to talk about to you guys with this webinar today. And we brought up these two pieces of information. One, 50 years ago, we didn't prepare for fires like we do today. We learned the hard way, unfortunately. Now we prepare for fires like it's no other. We prepare for them. We do fire drills all the time. And the result of that is that we haven't actually had a fire-related death in many, many years. Taking that and adapting it to things that have happened in more recent years, 15 years ago, and I can even say this, I'm really not that old, and I was in high school not that long ago, and I didn't even practice lockdowns maybe 8 years ago or so. 15 years ago, we didn't practice lockdowns regularly by any means. But obviously now we know in the past, I'd safely say 10 years, we have to practice these lockdowns regularly. And a lot of people have adopted some protocols and trainings and what have you on lockdowns because it's such a prevalent thing for us nowadays. Adopting these new policies seems, again, a lot easier said than done. You have to take what we've learned and move forward with that knowledge. We've adopted new practices nowadays which have saved countless lives, and we want to translate that into what you and your organization are going to continually do from here on out. We've learned a lot about lockdowns, we've learned a lot about earthquakes, and we've learned a lot about fires in the last couple of years, and a lot of people tend to not actually adopt those practices into their safety plan. What I've noticed with a lot of schools now, I'm just going to use this one school as an example, I won't mention their name, but the same particular school that had the safety plan that hadn't been updated since Loma Prieta, they had done trainings and they had done things on fire and earthquake and things like that, but they had never solidified any sort of protocol on what they're supposed to do. So a lot of people kind of said, well, we trained on this one time and we trained on this one time. And when I actually sat down and talked to the whole staff and faculty about this, there were probably 10 or 15 different answers about what they're supposed to do in the event of an emergency. So really important to update those protocols and keep everybody up to date and trained. Also, we've adopted the new practices which have saved countless lives, i.e. doing those fire drills. I was talking to Chris again, and he just mentioned that we haven't had a fire-related death in years, and we're trying to adopt that and move forward by practicing these lockdown drills and these earthquake drills and taking that same kind of data and applying it to these lockdowns. Bear with me just a second, guys. It seems I'm... Sorry, guys. Bear with me just a second. I'm trying to...
As Katelyn's working on the technology on that end, I'll share with each of you that one of the other components to emergency planning and really any sort of disaster planning is that, although, and I know I shared with you earlier, the state and the local levels often don't give you a specific criteria or set of guidelines with which you need to follow, and at the same time, we don't either. And so although there are a lot of guidelines that are out there and available, and there are a lot of different approaches to how we respond as a community to fire, and how we respond as a community to earthquake, and how we respond as a community to lockdown and severe weather and things of the like, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach that works for every school. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach, unfortunately, that fits for all regions even. And so certainly different practices and different protocols need to be created. One of the most sort of diverse set of options that exists is within the lockdown world. And we talked with you a couple of weeks ago about the difference between lockdown and shelter-in-place and secure campus. And after that, we engaged in some really good conversation with some of the schools that were on that webinar. And they said, we do these other things too, or we do these other things instead. And so when we lock down, we don't just lock down, but we actually will attempt to move people that are in an unaffected or unlocked down part of the campus off campus and try to get them to safety. And there's a whole program and protocol surrounding that called ALICE. And one of the concepts that's related to that is this theory that fighting back is good and acceptable and okay. And for some schools, that's the best option, and that makes a lot of sense. For other schools, lockdown means something entirely different, and this tends to be a little bit more true in the Northeast, where we have single school buildings a little bit more frequently than we have in, say, California. But in that environment, again, the lockdown sort of protocol and modality and style is so incredibly different because we have so far or so many less doors to have to be worried about. And if we can secure our external campus, we may actually be able to move freely within our campus or freely within our buildings. And so I like to share that emergency planning is certainly something that can be challenging. It certainly is something that can be diverse, and in fact, it's something that needs to be diverse and needs to be sort of applied to your specific school and your specific environment and the challenges that face that. I also shared with you a couple of weeks ago this school that we have that's on a federal property, and it's a federal property that happens to be very well protected by federal police and local police. And so, their style of lockdown is so different than the style of somebody who is in the middle of nowhere, for lack of a better term, or who doesn't have a strong urban area around them where police are readily accessible. And so as you're creating your safety plan or as you're updating your safety plan, one of the things to take into consideration is truly who you are and what your community responds best to. And in doing so, you can incorporate these components that may seem odd or different to another school, but seem perfect for you. And so don't feel as though, frankly, a template of any sort is ever going to be enough. Certainly don't feel as though you don't have the freedom to add anything that you want and or need to into your safety program and plan. And then don't think that your safety plan is just on paper. One of the things, and actually last year I gave several talks about the concept that your safety plan is actually your people. And what I mean by that is that if you can create a safety program on campus that's so strong that it engages every single staff and faculty member in one component or another, and it engages every student and actually enlists their support and their help, that the people on your campus are your plan. And they are the people, or they are the agents with which that we have the ability to respond to any emergency. And although it's still important to have a documented safety plan, and again, for many of you, it's actually the law that you have that. So don't let me undermine the importance there. It does give you the ability to rely a little bit more heavily on your staff and your faculty and your students, and to be safer and more confident as the emergency evolves. And so initially, you may be locking down, and you may have to deliver that message across a PA or across a radio system or any other method. But then after a few moments, you may realize that it's okay to actually back up a little bit and to just secure campus, because what happened turns out is several miles down the road. And it's good to have that documented in your safety plan. In fact, it's great to have that documented in your safety plan and to know that you have the capacity to either withdraw a little bit or really move into that sort of normal full lockdown. But it's even better if you've done this, if you've tested it, you've practiced it. And so when you deliver that message on the PA system or by text message or whatever your strategy is for getting that message out, that your staff, your faculty, your students are all comfortable with it, and they know, oh, well, we did this before in a drill. And so what we're going to do is now move from that lockdown that we were in to secure campus, which means that I can go back to my regular day, but I just can't leave and go off campus for lunch, which maybe is a drag. But they become that plan. They become the sort of nuts and bolts of your response to an emergency, and that's a really neat program. Now, again, this can't be sort of created overnight. We have schools that we've been working with for years to establish this type of sort of community response, and for the most part, when we're consistent and when we're pushing each and every staff and faculty member and each and every student to think safety and think safely, we are successful at building that plan and building the staff, faculty, and students to the point that they are the plan. And so I challenge you to, again, identify your safety plan, create a safety plan if you don't have one in place, or improve it if you were one of the 50% that said, we're not quite there yet. But then really try to push that safety plan off of paper and into life, and test and practice and test and practice and then review over and over again, whether it's on a monthly basis or a couple of times per semester, and obviously depending on the age group and your state requirements that may shift. But challenge yourself to actually get the people on your campus involved in the safety plan to the point that they don't even need to read it to know what to do next. And so Katelyn, I'll turn it back to you, but I wanted to share that with everybody. And it looks like we may have lost Katelyn.
Oops, I'm sorry. Can you guys hear me now?
Oh, there you are.
Okay, apologies. I was going through some technical difficulties on this end.
No worries.
Yes, training is incredibly important. I was just talking to myself for a second about that, but apparently a lot of schools out there nowadays will kind of just create their safety plan, even if they do adopt these new policies, and just give it to their staff and faculty. So that training that Chris was just talking about is incredibly, incredibly important. That is really what we had to talk about with you guys today. Basically what a safety plan is, what it should consist of, why it's important to have that safety plan, and kind of what it means to evolve that safety plan. Adopt those new practices and learn from the past and kind of adopt that new idea of thinking in the moment. Just for a second here, I'd like to go ahead and open up for questions, comments, and concerns. If you look on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a question box. And you guys can go ahead and ask us questions about safety plans or anything about today's webinar. I'll open that up for a couple of minutes, and then we can answer.
Awesome. And it looks like I see a couple of questions that are coming in. And the first question, and I'll turn this one over to you, Katelyn, is from, I'm going to say Ms. Stevens. I cannot figure out how to pronounce your first name. But for Ms. Stevens, and the question is, how long should our safety plan be?
Generally, when creating a safety plan, we go by the rule of thumb less than 30 pages. A lot of people like to do a manual that gives you every single possible scenario of every single thing that could happen, and it's almost just too much. So we aim for less than 30 pages.
Awesome. And this next, oh, go ahead.
I was just to follow up on that, you do want it to be detailed enough to where people know exactly what they're doing, but some people go into, like over here on the West Coast, like we've been mentioning, I don't necessarily need to put a hurricane protocol or a tornado protocol into my book, which some people actually do. So, and it just makes it that much longer, and a lot of people don't necessarily need that information at that point in time. So just adapt it to your people and aim for something around 25-30 pages.
Awesome. And this next one's from Janet, and the question is, do you ever offer an opportunity to evaluate safety plans? And Janet, that's a great question. We do certainly evaluate safety plans, and we do it in a number of different ways. For most of the schools that we work with, we actually work on an annual basis, and so we'll come in at any point in the year, and we'll start by essentially assessing where everything currently is, and really just getting our feet on the ground. What's working, what isn't working, what have you tried before, what has failed, what has succeeded, and we look at everything when we're doing that conversation and having that initial assessment. And when I say everything, I mean obviously we're looking at the safety stuff, right? So we're evaluating the overall structure, we're evaluating what components are in place and what needs to be added, but we also look at other things like communication style and how frequently you meet together as a staff or faculty and what your communication to students looks like. Because we have a number of schools for whom it's actually important that the consultant delivers information directly to student audiences, either in town hall or all-school meeting. And during those times, we can talk directly to them and share exactly what it is that they may be concerned about already. And obviously, during that assessment, we're also, of course, looking at safety plans and all the rest. The other way that we look at safety plans is sort of on an as-needed basis. And so we have a number of schools that just send us safety plans and say, hey, take a look at this. What do you think? And so we certainly can do that and help you sort of draft modifications, or if it's a safety plan that you feel like is not great and you just need somebody to say, yeah, you're right, this isn't great, start from scratch, we can do that too. And then my favorite type of safety plan to review, and we get these every once in a while. In fact, I have a client who I would now refer to more as a colleague and a friend, frankly, and he's in the San Francisco Bay Area. And every year I get a copy of his safety plan that he just sends over and says, hey, take a look at this and tell me what you think. And every year I have the incredible ability to just write back and say, hey, it looks great. And so it's not something that happens all the time, and it's certainly not something that frankly happens all that often, to be candid. But it is something that's pretty neat when somebody just sends us a really great plan and says, hey, take a look at this, give us your stamp of approval, and that's certainly something that we can do. Related to that, and one of the most challenging ways that we look at safety plans, probably the last way, is after a WASC accreditation or any other type of school accreditation visit has occurred, when the committee has decided that the safety plan and program is subpar. And the committee has either said that it's time for the school to do something or has made it very clear by not saying anything that the safety plan needs review and needs modification. And we get schools that way probably several times throughout each year. And they call us and they're sort of in a panic and say, well, we're not prepared, we're not safe, what do we do? And oftentimes the nuts and bolts are in place. It's a matter of bringing them all together and creating a program instead of a couple of documents, or creating a program instead of a couple of unrelated drills. And so I would say that's probably the most challenging way for us to review your safety plan, just because everybody is so nervous and anxious about it already at that point. There's that sort of sense of urgency that otherwise isn't there. But that's another way that we look at those. And to be fair, we also do look at safety plans proactively. So schools will say, hey, take a look at our program. Tell me what you think before those accreditation visits so that they're prepared. And in fact, I had a school several years ago that came to us and said, hey, we really want you to look at our safety plan, and we want you to tell us that we're great or tell us what's not great. And we want you to do that, by the way, because in 2 months our accreditation visit is happening, and we've already created all of our documentation for it, but we're a little bit nervous that we may get into some trouble with it. And so I took a look at the program overall, and they weren't doing drills, and they didn't really have a safety plan in place, and they really didn't have any sort of emergency notification system in place. And the school also didn't have a whole lot of emergency medication protocols or program in place, and didn't have a school nurse or anybody serving in the health office capacity, and didn't have any AEDs on campus, and had no disaster supplies. And you know where I'm going with this at this point. And what we did was we created this document called Next Steps. And we took all of the documents that the school did have, and we put those together. But then we wrote probably a 15-page document that talked about all of the things that the school was going to do in the next 18 months, and exactly how the school was going to go about achieving each of these goals that they had. And in doing so, we were actually able to not only pass the accreditation, but have a lot of enthusiasm and excitement with the accreditation visit. And it was very, very successful. And so if you're a school who's in that category where you're going, I just don't think we've got it all put together, but our accreditation visit is too soon, and we just don't have time to make the changes that we need to before that happens. If nothing else, if you can take a good, strong look at everything that you have in your safety program, document that, and then think about the difference between where you are and where you'd like to be, or where you are and you think that the accreditation body might want to see you sort of at. And try to figure out what those gaps are, document those gaps as areas for improvement, as goals, and then articulate exactly how you're going to achieve those goals. So whether it's bringing on a consultant to support you, or hiring a health aide to support you, or calling on your parent community to help support you, or any other number of things. Challenge yourselves to articulate as many sort of concrete strategies as you possibly can, and oftentimes the accreditation bodies will look at that and go, okay, well, there's a plan in place. We can see improvement in place. We see where this is going, and in fact, more often than not, they'll get behind you and support you if at all possible. So with that, it looks like those were our two big questions. It looks like there's one more, and this is going to be a personal follow-up. So either myself or somebody from our consulting team will follow up with you in just a little while. And again, if you have any other questions that we haven't answered yet, feel free to share those on the right-hand side of your screen. I would like to share a couple of quick updates with you before we let you go today. And the first one is that over the course of the next several weeks, we'll be conducting our annual Brunch and Learn. And actually, this now occurs a couple of times throughout the year. Brunch and Learns are an opportunity for schools to come together. We try to keep the groups relatively small, definitely below 60, sometimes below 30, in order to sort of facilitate some good collaborative conversation about school safety and talk about challenges that the schools are encountering, talk about some of the areas for improvement that we all find ourselves struggling with, evaluate strategies for improvement. In California, the Brunch and Learn is specifically going to be talking about the immunization laws and some of the changes therein. In the Northeast, we're going to be talking specifically about the evolution of the lockdown and how far that truly has come over the course of the last 4 to 6 years. And so if you have a moment and can join us at those Brunch and Learns, we certainly invite you to do so. If you're a school that would like to host us and actually host that Brunch and Learn and invite your community in, other schools, other folks into that Brunch and Learn, feel free to let us know, and you can actually email the email that we'll put up on the screen here in just a moment and say, hey, I want to host, or I'd like to get more information about the one that's coming towards me. Right now we're looking at several communities that we'll be coming to. The first is New York, the second is Boston, Connecticut, San Francisco, and/or Oakland, of course Los Angeles, which is where our home office is. And so we'll be doing that over the course of the next couple of weeks for the first time this year, and then we'll be doing it again at the beginning of the spring. And so although you may not necessarily be able to host us in a couple of weeks, we certainly would love to be able to talk with you about spring or even summer, and worst case scenario, maybe even next year. With that, just a couple of other things that we'd like to share with you. Obviously, this is a series that takes place every Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific and 1 p.m. Eastern. We actually have an interesting audience today in that the majority of you are from the Northeast, which is incredible. It's one of our newer markets and newer regions that we're working with, and so we're so incredibly happy to be able to be talking with you and to have you with us. And so for you on the Northeast, as well as anybody else anywhere in the country, we would like to encourage you to join us every Thursday for this series and learn more about school safety in general, and about how to make it actionable and how to take the conversations that we're having during this time and build a list of steps for your school, for your community. And I got a funny email from somebody the other day that said, you challenge us to do a lot. And I said, yeah, but it's safety. And they said, okay, well, we'll do it then. So participate in these challenges, take them on, and do all that you can to create a safer school for your students, for your staff, for your faculty. With that, we do have a survey that we'll share with you momentarily via the chat. Tell us a little bit about how these webinars are going for you, especially for those of you that are with us on each week's webinar. Tell us what's working, tell us what you're struggling with, and frankly, what we're most excited to hear about is anything that you would like to hear but that you haven't heard yet. Over the course of the next couple of weeks, again, we'll be talking about everything from lice to business continuity. And then when we kick off right after the new year, we'll be talking about some of the teams. And as we prepare for our big moulage drill, which is our annual drill that we do for most of our schools at least once a year, we'll be talking about specific activities and specific functions that each team serves, search and rescue and first aid and the like. So stay tuned for those. And if you have any questions at all, please email us at schools@joffeemergencyservices.com, and I will go ahead and chat that out to you as well. Again, I'd like to thank every one of you for being on this webinar with us and for joining us. And if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to either email schools@joffeemergencyservices.com or give us a call. And again, that survey link's on your screen now, and we've chatted it out to you as well. So thank you again for being with us, and we can't wait to see you next Thursday. Have a great weekend and a great week in the meantime.